everyone. Welcome to the lecture series on understanding Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy. Today, I want to talk about why Bertrand Russell's book, The Problems of Philosophy, is such an excellent starting point for anyone who wants to understand philosophy. Philosophy can often feel intimidating. There are dense texts, abstract arguments, and centuries of debate. But Russell manages to make philosophy approachable without losing its depth. There is clarity in his writing, and there are no unnecessary jargons. Even the complex ideas are explained in uncomplicated language. And this makes the book The Problems of Philosophy reachable even to those who are completely new to philosophy. But before that, a few things about the great Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was not only a brilliant philosopher, he was also a gifted teacher. His personality and approach to philosophy shaped the way he wrote and taught. He wanted philosophy to be a living force in the world. He remained academically active for almost 70 years. He was popular in the media as well. With the publication of Principia Mathematica between 1910 and 1913, he achieved widespread recognition in the intellectual circles. He also attracted negative attention for his liberal views on politics, religion, and education in his writings such as Marriage and Morals, published in 1929, and Why I'm Not a Christian, published in 1957. He was a courageous, free thinker with strong political convictions. He campaigned fervently against nuclear weapons. He was also imprisoned for 6 months for supposedly defaming the British government and the US Army. Now, coming back to his book, The Problems of Philosophy. Written in 1912, this book reflects a turning point in philosophy. It bridges traditional metaphysics with the emerging analytic philosophy of the 20th century. Reading, studying, and reflecting on the different chapters of this book gives us an insight into how philosophy evolved in the modern era. This book introduces us to fundamental philosophical questions like, what is reality? What is knowledge? How do we distinguish appearance from reality? And these are the perennial questions that lie at the heart of philosophy. And Russell presents these questions in a way that actually sparks curiosity. Of course, there are a great number of philosophical problems which Russell has not focused on in this book, but that does not diminish the importance of the book as it presents a systematic exploration of epistemology. I also want to emphasize that Russell's method and style of writing, philosophizing is just fantastic. And he describes it in his book, History of Western Philosophy, which he wrote in 1945, in which he says, "For my part, I have found that when I wish to write a book on some subject, I must first soak myself in detail until all the separate parts of the subject matter are familiar. Then someday, if I am fortunate, I perceive the whole, with all its parts duly interrelated. After that, I only have to write down what I have seen. The nearest analogy is first walking all over a mountain in a mist, until every path and ridge and valley is separately familiar, and then from a distance seeing the mountain whole and clear in bright sunshine." In this passage, Russell has beautifully demonstrated the distinction between epistemic and epistemological. Both these words have their origin in the Greek word episteme, which means knowledge. The word epistemic pertains to the details of what we know, whereas the word epistemological relates to how we know what we know. And in this analogy, Russell depicts epistemology as a vibrant, sunlit view of a mountain as seen from far off. Before I explain the first chapter, I would like to say that this book is not only for students enrolled in a philosophy curriculum. Russell's work speaks to anyone who is simply interested in the subject. Whether you are a student of literature, science, or just someone who enjoys big questions about life, knowledge, and reality, this book offers insights that enrich your perspective. Philosophy, as Russell reminds us, is valuable because it enlarges our conception of what is possible. The first chapter of the book will gradually make you aware of Russell's methodical and thorough investigation into the difference between appearance and reality. In fact, Russell kind of endorses Plato's view that there is a hidden reality beyond what is apparent. But he says that we are in no position to comment decisively on such a realm. So, this much for the introduction of the first chapter, Appearance and Reality. Now, let's dive into it. The chapter opens with Bertrand Russell seated in his study at Trinity College, Cambridge. Sometime between 1910 and 1912, he looks up from his desk at the window outside the window, the manicured lawns, the trickling fountain, and the historic edifices built in warm-toned sandstone. In the style of Descartes, he is contemplating the epistemological question: is there any knowledge in the world which is so certain that no reasonable man can doubt? His gaze then passes around his study over the familiar items he sees every day. The chairs, the desk, the papers scattered on the top of the desk. Ultimately, his gaze settles on an oblong coffee table in the center of the room. And he engages in what has in due course become the famous talking point on the distinction between appearance and reality. Russell, in the beginning of the chapter itself, shows how a dichotomy is established where on one side is the practical view which favors the straightforward interpretation of the table, whereas on the other side is a philosophical bent which gives a critical interpretation. So, this simple act is already philosophically problematic. Let us see how. To one person, the table looks brown. To another, in different light, it looks reddish. Its shape changes depending on where one stands. Rectangular here, trapezoidal there. Even its texture seems smooth in one glance, rough in another. As Russell says, it is evident from what we have found that there is no color which can be rightly called the color of the table or even of any one particular part of the table. What we are directly aware of, Russell says, are sense data, the colors, shapes, textures as they appear to us. Yet, we instinctively believe there is a real table behind these appearances. Russell cautions us when he says, the real table, if there is one, is not the same as what we immediately perceive by sight or touch or hearing. So, here lies the philosophical problem. If all we ever encounter are appearances, how can we be sure of the reality that supposedly lies beneath them? Is the real table the same as the one we see, or is it something entirely different? At this point, I would like you to ponder over this. When you say you know there is a table in front of you, what exactly do you mean? Do you mean the shifting colors and shapes you see, or the hidden object you believe exists behind them? Actually, Russell wants us to feel the tension between everyday certainty and philosophical doubt. The ordinary world dissolves into a web of appearances, and philosophy begins when we ask what lies beyond them. Russell doesn't solve the problem in chapter 1. Instead, he sets the stage. The task of philosophy is to distinguish appearance from reality and to ask what grounds we have for believing in things beyond our immediate perception. To put it in another way, philosophy begins when the table in front of you stops being obvious. Let me explain Russell's point in detail. When one wonders, is there any knowledge of the world that is beyond doubt? This is the beginning of epistemology. It seems that the knowledge I get from my immediate experiences is beyond doubt. I am sitting here, there is a brown table in front of me, I am drinking a cup of tea, occasionally looking out of the window at the sun, and so on. However, all of this may reasonably be doubted. What perhaps cannot be doubted is that I am presently having experiences. But it can be doubted that I am presently seeing a brown table, holding a pen in my hand, drinking sweet tea, and looking out at the sun. Let us take the example of the color of the table. Is it brown all over, or is it different shades of brown in different parts of the table depending on how much light is falling on it? Here, we need to make a distinction between appearance and reality. Appearance means the way things seem to be, and reality means the way things are. The color I see varies from my point of view, and it varies from the point of views of others. Someone who is colorblind may be seeing the table as dark orange instead of brown. The colors of the table then, which are seen from different points of view, are in the realm of appearances. Common sense leads us to say that besides the apparent colors of the table, there is a real color of the table. The same applies to the shape of the table. It may seem to have different shapes from different points of view, but we want to say that it has a real shape, perhaps of rectangularity. Similar observations can be made of the sense of touch and sound as well. So, it becomes clear that there is a difference between the apparent table and the real table. What I experience is the apparent table, and this is immediately known to me. The real table, if it exists at all, is not immediately known to me at all. The knowledge of the real table must be inferred from the immediately known apparent table. So, there are two difficult questions that arise. Number 1, is there a real table at all? Number 2, if so, what sort of object can it be? Russell now brings in what he calls sense data and sensation. Sense data is what is immediately known in sensation. Colors, sounds, smells, hardness, roughness, and so on are types of sense data. Sensation is the experience of being immediately aware of sense data. Whenever I see a color, I have a sensation of color. But what I see is not a sensation but the sense data of a color. Even though sense data are not in the mind, it is not clear whether they are in any object. I have sense data of various types when I see a table. But is this sense data part of the table? Is there a table at all? These are not easy questions to deal with. The real table, if it exists at all, is the physical table. The collection of all physical objects is called matter. We can now reformulate our two questions asked of the table earlier as number 1, is there any such thing as matter? Number 2, if so, what is the nature of it? Now, George Berkeley, an Anglo-Irish philosopher in the 18th century, claimed that the immediate objects of our senses do not have an independent existence on their own. There is then no real table beyond the apparent table seen, felt, and touched by me. Berkeley provides a series of arguments to demonstrate that the existence of matter can be denied. That if anything exists independent of the mind, we could never have any knowledge of. We can only have knowledge of what is perceived by us. So, for Berkeley, there is no distinction between sense data and object, and not even a distinction between sensation and sense data. When we say matter does not exist, there are two ways to think of matter. The first is to think of matter as something opposed to the mind. The second is to think of matter as something independent of the human mind. Berkeley denies matter in the first sense, but not in the second sense. Let us see how he does that. Matter in the first sense means something that is opposed to the mind, something that exists in space, and it has nothing of spirituality or consciousness in it. In this sense, Berkeley denies the existence of matter. He claims that everything that exists is either a mind or an idea in a mind. This is the view of idealism. Berkeley is nonetheless a common sense philosopher. He claims that when I go out of this room and no one else is in the room, the brown table, which I am now perceiving, will continue to exist. So that when I come back in the room, I am not surprised to find the same brown table there. Now, if the brown table is nothing but an idea in a mind, and since neither my mind nor anyone else's mind was in the room for a period of time, how did it continue to exist during that period? It would be absurd and counter common sense to say that it goes in and out of existence as there are minds or no minds in the room to perceive it. Berkeley found a solution to the problem. When no human minds are around to perceive the brown table, the table is perceived by the mind of God, which can perceive all ideas everywhere. So, real ideas are ideas in God's mind, and apparent ideas are ideas in our minds. So, for Berkeley, the real table is external to the human mind but in God's mind, and the apparent table is in human minds. For those who believe in physical objects as existing in space, the real table is outside any mind but in space. All philosophers seem to agree that there is a real table that is independent of our minds, and that this table is made up of sense data, and these sense data are also independent of our minds. Our minds have sensations about the sense data leading to our knowledge of the sense data and thereby to the knowledge of the objects that are made up of sense data. Even though all philosophers agree that there is a table, a real table, external to our minds, they do not agree on what the nature of the real table is. What we immediately perceive does not provide us with direct knowledge of the external object or the real table. What we immediately perceive is the relationship between our sensations and the sense data that we perceive. This provides us with the knowledge of the apparent object, not the real object. Now, this leads first to the question whether there is any reality at all external to the mind. And when we raise this question, we are immediately led to a distinction between appearance and reality. What appears to us immediately, like the brownness of the table in front of us, seems to be known beyond doubt. But this is knowledge about the apparent brown and the apparent table, not about the real brown and the real table. The knowledge of the real table seems to be elusive. However, we can acquire knowledge of the real world by inference from our knowledge of the apparent world. We may get knowledge that there is a real table by inferring from our knowledge of the different properties of the apparent table. Even though we may get this knowledge by inference of the existence of the real table, we may not be able to acquire knowledge of the nature of the real table. Furthermore, the inference we are making seems to be an inference to the best explanation, and there seems to be no guarantee that there is a real table. In other words, we explain the existence of the apparent table causally by positing a real table that causes the apparent table, but we cannot guarantee that this is the cause. Hence, we could easily be skeptical even of the existence of the real table. This is how Russell shows us that the distinction between appearance and reality is not a puzzle to be solved once and for all. In fact, it is the very starting point of philosophy. With this, I will end this lecture. Thank you.